Cosmos, the goddess of harmony. Chaos, the god of discord. Reigning from distant realms, the two gods had gathered warriors from all lands to lead them in savage war. Cosmos and Chaos were of equal strength. It was believed the conflict would last forever. But
sometimes they're warriors of light, and sometimes they're warriors of darkness. Just examine Cloud, Squall, or Cecil, and you'll see what I mean. Or examine Terra, who is half human and half Esper, and is used by the Empire to destroy nations.
But wait, Cecil, who is also used to destroy nations, is only half human as well. Sedaine isn't human at all. Cloud is infused with Genova's cells, and Squall merges with a guardian force but literally consumes his memories. Sedaine was created as a weapon, and so was Vivi. The L'Cie are often created to destroy and kill. Several of the Light Warriors began their careers working for the enemy, and some of them initially chose to. The protagonists in Final Fantasy are often adoptive or blood relatives to the villains as well. There are certainly a loose pattern. FF3 mentions the Warriors of Darkness a few times, implying that the Warriors are balancing forces, called upon to restore the equilibrium. This certainly makes sense when we remember the crystals and their purpose in the games. Because the main characters are always portrayed as good, it is likely that the Warriors of Light and Dark will not represent good and evil, but Yang and Yin. However, in some of the games, such as Final Fantasy XI, there are classes that are described as being forbidden and soul-destroying. Dark Knight is an example of an unbalanced class that persists in the series. Typically, the Dark Knights must consume their own life energy in order to fully utilize these self-destructive talents. However, a class such as Black Mage is not portrayed as unbalanced, even when contrasted with the righteous White Mage, who can only use her powers to heal herself and others. Unless she's fighting something undead, then she's a ruthless re-killing machine. All of the classes hurt their opponents.
So what makes them Light Warriors or Dark Warriors? The heroes are always needed in every game to restore balance and equilibrium to the universe. So, that being said, maybe if we examine the later games, we can classify them as Dark or Light Warriors even though they're not usually named as such.
Of course, it is also possible that some of them are simply warriors, who are not aligned with any particular thing, or that their alignment is not the point. In the earlier games, the Light Warriors were informed that they were Light Warriors near the beginning of the game, and they didn't question it.
As the series progressed, there has been less and less indication of the alignment.
FF13, Tactics, and 10 make it hard for some gamers to tell whose side they're on right off the bat. Sometimes the heroes even turn on one another. The only thing I could think of to make this more clear was to examine the world setting in each Final Fantasy. One conclusion I came to was that although there is basically always a presence of an evil empire, in some of the games it's implied that the villains are humans, and in some of the games the villains are primarily monsters or demons hiding behind a couple of individuals. Additionally, in some of the games magic was used primarily for destructive purposes, but was not accessible to humanity, and in some games it was used primarily for good, but was shunned by the oppressed humanity. This pattern is not perfectly consistent, but it does help to create a clearer picture of how some worlds have either too much chaos or too much order and would need to be saved.
In Buddhism, Yin is considered to be a severe, dark, chaotic, and feminine force that holds order and balance, and Yang is considered to be a light, merciful, masculine force that holds chaos and balance.
It is a common belief in philosophy, religion, and spiritualism that light and dark cannot exist without one another. This concept is also implied in the Final Fantasy series. Considering some of the philosophical and spiritual parallels we already examined in the previous episode, I'm going to attempt to determine which Final Fantasy worlds are chaos and which worlds are of order. FF1 is a universe that uses magic, but generally not to excess. The crystals are naturally light-aligned, but they end up going dark, and the world takes damage as a result. The four elemental archfiends create a time paradox and a demon called Chaos to maintain the cycle of chaos that destroys the planet. This is a universe that requires light and order to survive. FF6 takes place in a world that is dominated and oppressed by an empire, The villain Kefka savagely attacks the planet and dominates the survivors under an iron fist. The Espers are drained of their energy and used to make war machines. Some of the characters are literally feral, and they are rebels to their nation. The use of magic is generally forbidden, but it is contact with Espers and the use of magic that allows the party to free the world. This is a universe that requires chaos to survive. FF7's Gaia is under the tight control of a massive corporation. The very planet is being drained of its life force, and rebellion is met with brutality. The heroes are rough around the edges due to the societies they live in, and they are required to sneak, spy, assassinate, and even cross-dress in order to advance the plot. This is a universe that requires chaos. FF8's antagonist plans to compress time and unleash a powerful lunar attack on the world. The heroes are banded together right from the start, and teamwork, friendship, and military training are all necessary tools in the development of the plot and the success of the team. This is a universe that requires order.
This is only one of several ways we can break down the plots and determine the alignment of the warriors. Whether or not you agree with my model, perhaps you can agree that there is a recurring struggle between order and chaos in the series.
Perhaps it is relevant to the alignment of the warriors, and perhaps it is not. It is worth mentioning that none of the games are completely dark or light. In fact, I believe that the presence and necessity of both polarities is partially what gives the series some of its identity. In most of the games, there are positive heroes as well as negative heroes with real flaws, addictions, and sorrows dragging them down, regardless of whether or not they're light warriors. The worlds in Final Fantasy convey a grace and subtlety juxtaposed with a sense of grandeur and order.
The forces of heaven and earth coexist in peace and harmony as long as the villains are kept under wraps.
Some of the games begin well after the world has been conquered or ruined, but there are always remnants of lost, often utopian civilizations and beautiful stretches of nature that are still intact. In most of these lost nations, the use of magic and technology for war is what led to their downfall or ruin, although it was usually the villains who started it.
Fire!
The Light and Shadow Warriors do more good deeds than some of the players may realize.
Right from the beginning of the games, there are usually bosses, mini-bosses, and archfiends ready to destroy everyone they encounter. Even some of the anti-heroes would likely be foiled should these demons of deep one day find their way out of the dungeons, since many of the monsters would likely eat the princesses that the villains need to kidnap, or at least kill the people whom the villains are looking forward to hurting. The drama between the villains and heroes usually keeps the citizens alive, since the villains usually force the heroes to traverse fiend-infested dungeons, taking out all of the bosses along the way. A large chunk of the good that the protagonists do is the lowering of the monster population, for which they usually receive little praise.
In two-dimensional RPGs in the 80s and 90s, usually one could tell immediately whether or not a character was important to the plot simply by looking at them.
If they were a main character, they would have a completely unique sprite. If they were not a main character, but they were still very important to the quest, they would not have a unique sprite, but would be colored differently from the rest. Their costumes were fantastic and sometimes even absurd. The same is also true of the more modern FF characters. Any cosplayer will likely tell you that putting together the extravagant hairstyles of Final Fantasy is extremely time-consuming and often challenging. Just take a look at Seymour from FF10 to see what I mean. Ever since Final Fantasy I, they've usually had bright colors and elaborate, beautiful outfits, some of which can be difficult to avert one's eyes from. Rydia from Final Fantasy IV is a good example of this. Although all the characters from FF4 have interesting outfits, hers is so bright, vivid, unique, beautiful, and intricate, but I've sometimes turned the game on just to look at her. We partially have Yoshitaka Amano to thank for this. His inspiring concept art has added a fathomless layer of glamour and magic to the series that has captivated millions of fans. But it's not just the design of the characters that has made the heroes into such amazing fantasy icons. The Light Warriors and Dark Warriors are special in innumerable ways. One of the things that makes them seem special is presentation. Naturally, the protagonists are focused on, as with most fiction, in greater depth than the supporting characters and NPCs.
The limelight they get definitely adds to their importance, but there is still more than that.
Even now, the NPCs are literally all clones of one another. They're all rather bland for the most part, causing the heroes to really pop. Additionally, most of the NPCs are all living such boring, tiny little lives compared with the heroes. Although the lives of some of the NPCs are elaborated on in a couple of the games, such as FF6 and 9, with characters like part-time worker Mary or Cyan's pen pal, and are regarded similarly to movie extras. In most stories, the main characters display the most interesting character traits, and the reader, player, or viewer is usually meant to sympathize with them. But when we play as the Final Fantasy heroes, we get to be shimmering, glittering high mages and paladins, world-class champion acrobats and athletes who can jump as high as skyscrapers, and merciful, pious clerics who can raise the dead.
We get to be the strongest, best-looking, and most needed person in the universe.
Final Fantasy is one of the many works of fiction that allows the consumer to be not only special, but the most special person in the world when they project themselves into the protagonist. These characters could beat up just about anybody if they had enough Phoenix Downs in their pockets, and they are always in perfect health and top physical condition no matter what happens to them. In real life, millions of people are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after experiencing violent, life-threatening, or emotionally disturbing events, and some people never fully recover. It's also known as shell shock, named for war veterans, because war and combat are so stressful and horrifying to those involved that they can become sick, depressed, scared, or disturbed for years after the experience is over. This is also semi-common after car accidents, personal abuse, and all kinds of incidents in which a person feels victimized or betrayed. Generally speaking, the more times a person has to experience highly stressful events in their life, the more likely they are to feel traumatized. The protagonists of Final Fantasy go through some rather nasty conflicts. They are frequently getting into trouble, falling, crashing, fighting, and getting maimed and occasionally killed, while being routinely attacked, kidnapped, betrayed, hurt, and cheated. Some people would lose all their confidence if they had to go through what these protagonists endure, but the heroes of light frequently act as though they are underwhelmed by this. They tend to remain in character as often as possible, particularly in the later games, with dialogue taking place even on the battlefield. Let's not forget that in every FF battle system it is impossible to play and beat the game without your characters taking a few hits. And by a few hits, I mean a lot of hits. Endless hits. These people are getting beaten, blown up, shot, bitten, burned, frozen, electrocuted, doused, poisoned, sliced, and diced every single day, and yet they seem totally unaffected by it.
They have to endure some of the most horrifying physical punishments we can think of, but that's not even the true horror of what they face.
The characters have to do some things that non-psychopaths couldn't possibly be ready for. Imagine having to kill for the first time. The heroes of light have to battle to survive and to protect others, and not just monsters. They have to kill humans too. Some of the protagonists are unmistakably good, compassionate, and merciful, so try to picture how they might feel before, during, and after killing a human soldier, knowing that he might have had a family waiting at home, and knowing that he too believed in what he was fighting for better or worse, the killer would be forever changed.
Psychological horror often involves this concept of realizing the gravity of what one has done.
There are other elements of horror that can be found in FF going all the way back to the first one. Just about every common fear or phobia can be found in the series, and must be faced by the Light Warriors, including the supernatural ones. The sprites and textures in the games are stylized and beautiful, but some of them may appear a little more sinister in real life. Think about all the giant spiders, airship crashing, zombies, sewers, and archfiends, and then think about the ages of the characters, which typically range from 6 to 24, most of whom are teenagers. In order for the story of any given installment in the series to be believable, we must consider that the chosen champions are especially brave, hardy, and strong, because just about everything they face would render real-life people helpless, seized with debilitating fear, panic, and shock.
In some of the games, one or two of the characters do eventually have episodes when all of the tragedy eventually catches up with them.
In Final Fantasy VI, after Kefka attacks the world, Terra loses her will to battle and is unable to use any of her skills or abilities to fight, even when she is attacked. There is also Cloud's coma, in which she is forced to delve deep into his psyche, and with Tifa's help is able to find peace. There is also Dagger's loss of voice and occasional inability to cast spells, along with her frequent memories of the destruction of cities. Almost every character technically has some sort of breakdown or reaction to all the stress and discomfort. I also want to suggest that some of the grumpier characters might act the way they do in response to their personal turmoil. Their personalities tend to reflect their circumstances in each game.
I think that the bottom line is that each character has the determination to rise above the struggle, and that they each find their courage and their guiding light in different ways.
Sometimes they find this beacon of hope accidentally. It sometimes replaces a sinister goal, such as Vaughn's vengeance, or Setzer's grand kidnapping scheme. Both characters ended up getting sucked into the plot, made friends with the other party members, and learned about the quest. The realization of the truth, I believe, gave them the strength they needed in order to fight for the greater good and save the planet.
For most of the characters, it's their ability to see in clarity the importance of their success and the preciousness of life that keeps them out of the bowels of despair and insanity, most of the time.
One of the most unrealistic things about Final Fantasy, and indeed all video games, is that the appearance of the characters basically never changes in any way when they get hurt. All of the blades, flames, and acids would have totally destroyed their clothing and permanently scarred and disfigured them in reality. Most of the characters don't even wear proper armor, and some of them may as well be in bikinis. I probably don't need to say that most video game consoles wouldn't be powerful enough to add very much realism to the fights. The PlayStation would probably freeze if it tried to render every single nick, slice, and bruise on each character in Final Fantasy VIII, not to mention the physics involved in shredding three-dimensional costumes and severing limbs.
But even if the consoles could render that kind of realism, would it really be in the gamer's best interest?
There are plenty of gory games on the market, but Final Fantasy is not one of them. If a demographic is interested in gore, it's definitely not the only thing they seek in a video game franchise. If Final Fantasy was more gory, its demographic would change, and some of its fans would be alienated because the entire series would need to change drastically to accommodate it.
I have a theory that I'd like to share. What if the cure magic fully restores the bodies of the characters?
But that's not all. What if it repairs the equipment as well? In Final Fantasy, practically everything is infused with or made out of magic. Some of the equipment is definitely magical as well, and since all magic seems to come from the same source, it could be possible that in the crystal universe, Mako mana or spirit energy is constantly surging through everything and enabling magic on the physical plane. When Beatrix casts Curaga, she could be repairing Steiner's flesh and rusty armor as well as restoring his energy. As I mentioned in the previous episode, it's very possible that the hallowed white magic could bend the rules of space and time a little bit, or a lot, in order to restore the target to a previous state. When I say target, I mean target. In Final Fantasy Tactics, the spells splash onto whomever is beside the person or area of the map that the player selects. These spells could easily be splashing onto the equipment of the injured and freezer-burned targets, preventing us from seeing the impending nudity. Maybe it also gets the blood, soot, and slime stains out.
Something that I haven't yet delved into is the possible psychological effect that the magic could have on the protagonists.
In many of the games, the magic is a lifestyle. Mages usually come from schools, clans, or religious sects, and have devout belief systems. In real life, religion, spirituality, and faith have helped people through times of grief, unrest, and poverty. In the context of Final Fantasy, the mages are connected to other realms where gods and espers hail from, in a similar fashion to devout humans in real life. Something that comes to mind is that the presence of the magic might have a comforting or adversely sinister air. With this in mind, one possible explanation as to how the heroes can endure such hardship is because they have deities comforting and guiding them. Sometimes this happens literally in the series to the mage characters. Espers and Eidolons come to their side to help them through a crisis. Usually the characters who are most connected to the deities are the most emotionally sensitive, and would be the most likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder in real life. The summons are regarded in many of the games as being spells, so I like to imagine that the other magic interacts with the casters and targets in a similar fashion. Perhaps having life, arise, curaga, regen, or protect invoked in one's general direction would feel very empowering, refreshing, or pleasurable. Maybe a cure is a much-needed total refresh of body and soul.
Most of the protagonists have intensely specific personalities.
Yeah, you
They
look
tend
so
to be
good.
very
What
caricatured
happened?
and at times somewhat cartoon-like.
You beat me up, remember?
Huh?
There's usually a plucky one, a jaded one, a courageous one, and a shy one, for example.
Their personalities have also become somewhat predictable. Nowadays, we can take educated guesses about what the characters will sound like and how they will behave based only on their appearance.
Before 13 came out, I had imagined the personalities and voices of all 6 main characters in great detail, and my prediction was dead on.
I'm serious all the time, so everyone believes I'm a soldier in spite of my hair.
The Fal'Cie has her captive, but I'll find her.
Everyone stop treating me like I'm a child. I'm an adult.
How can you save a C? You're not...
Ha ha ha, what, who, me? Yeah, I'm real tough. You gonna lend me a hand or what?
I'm real grumpy, but also kinda goofy.
Trenchcoat, where you going?
Sometimes you have to keep smiling no matter what. You gotta be cool if you want to get in with me.
I've got point. You fall in behind. And see if you can't cool off that head of yours.
This could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing.
It's probably bad if it means that the series is getting tired and repetitive, but it's probably good if it simply means that Square Enix is good at making solid, well-rounded characters whose outward appearances match their personalities. Maybe Final Fantasy is just a well-casted game.
The reception of certain characters, particularly the later games from 10 and up, varies to extremes.
There are certain types of characters that tend to annoy fans more than others, but web-based polls show that they are generally all liked by a substantial percent of consumers.
Wait a minute. You mean you were joking?
Now we're even.
Oh! Hey! Wait!
I personally think that although the characters could always get worse, a lot of them could get better as well. They'd certainly be likable to more gamers if some of them were less stereotypical.
But just as Western theater still uses the stock characters from Commedia dell'arte, Japanese RPGs and anime use and reuse sets of familiar, exaggerated character types. Although Final Fantasy, for the most part, has its own brand of stock characters, which I will be further elaborating on in the next episode, some of them are only unique compared with the NPCs or because of their weapons, attire, or measurements.
I think that the characters can be as unique as the player. Although a lot less is left to the imagination these days, there's still a lot of room for exploration, whether it's through class or travel or equipment or side quests.
Some of the newer games allow for a great deal of customization, such as Final Fantasy XIV, in which the player has full control over practically everything he does with his character. In MMORPGs, gamers usually have far more room to control the actions, personality, and appearance of the characters.
The gamer can become virtually anybody she wants to.
However, many gamers choose to make characters act and look very similarly to themselves. There seems to be a desire in gamers to be someone else in some ways, and yet still the same in other ways. I have thought of several theories about why.
One of them is that the players feel more affinity for the quest if they can pretend that it is them having the adventure. Some gamers even make their friends, spouses, and pets in the games they play.
Another possible theory is that some of the players feel extra important when they play themselves in a video game. They can make themselves only better. With better health, more money, and amazing powers, they deserve the credit the villagers give them.
It's also possibly an exciting way for them to explore themselves while exploring an exciting quest. They can ask themselves, what would I do if I had to make that choice in real life within a non-threatening, non-committal environment?
RPGs can be an excellent way to make gamers feel special. They can project themselves into an on-screen or imaginary person who is a pseudo-paradigm of the player's personal perfection. RPGs can literally be a celebration of the self, but I believe that in many cases they are also cathartic experiences that bring out the true feelings of the gamer. If you have ever played any MMORPGs, you may be all too aware of this. You may have encountered a great number of frustrated individuals using the gaming world as a place to blow off steam, sometimes even at the expense of other gamers. Of course, in most of the linear main series Final Fantasies, the player is forced to play a good guy, which may seem too limiting if we think that RPGs are primarily about choices. But I could argue that the fans of the series probably wouldn't play it if it was such an undesirable thing to be a good guy.
I read an article on the internet that argued that video games can teach gamers about morality. I personally agree with this theory.
Most RPGs reward the player for being good, even when being bad is an option. There is a reward system present in Final Fantasy that causes gamers to feel happy about being the best they can be, which is possibly the reason that the fans aren't all complaining about being unable to kill the townspeople or destroy the props. In the main series installments, gamers can pick one of 4 to 10 heroes of light or darkness to sympathize with. Usually the most popular characters are the protagonists in the series, but the other party members usually get plenty of lines in character-building cutscenes. Because any given FF posse has a variety of personality types, we can roleplay more effectively than we could if there was only one hero. But it is a little more like a book with a complex interactive battle system than a role-playing game in reality. This is why English-speaking gamers often make a distinction between JRPGs and regular RPGs.
Roleplay has been steadily evolving since its invention, and video games now exist on a series of spectrum.
Fleshed out story to minimum story, open-ended to linear, preset characters to fully customizable characters, and silent protagonists to customizable speech. The RPG genre has become more and more ambiguous, especially with the advent of cross-genre games such as Mass Effect. Final Fantasy was among the first of the RPG franchises to include talkative protagonists who have relationships with one another, serving to make the heroes of light especially memorable.
Thank you for watching part 4 of Final Fantasy: The Psychology and Philosophy. The next episode is going to be about the archetypes of the characters in the series.